A boy donated his allowance to help a stranger. Days later, he got a life-changing gift. The glass door of the diner chimed as David stepped in, his movements tentative. He paused at the entrance, his eyes scanning the room before lighting up as he spotted Rachel and Daniel. He made his way to an empty table by the window, pulling out a chair and nodding a greeting to Rachel, who was serving a nearby table. When Rachel approached to take his order, David looked up, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about you and Daniel ever since that day at the grocery store. Daniel's gesture really changed the course of my day." He hesitated before continuing. "Would you and Daniel be willing to join me for lunch tomorrow? I truly want to thank you both properly." Rachel paused for a moment, but seeing the sincerity in David's eyes, she nodded gently. "All right, we'd be happy to accept." Daniel, lost in his drawings, had no idea that tomorrow's meal would mark a turning point in their lives. Life is sometimes wonderfully unpredictable. A single act of kindness can set in motion changes we never imagined. You ever experienced a moment where kindness led to something truly remarkable? Share your story to spread inspiration and turn kindness into a guiding light in our lives. The story begins. Daniel tugged at his mother's hand as they passed through the sliding doors of the small grocery store in their neighborhood. At just 11 years old, Daniel had developed a strong sense of responsibility, a feeling that had only grown over the past few months as he'd watched his mother work tirelessly at the diner and spend long nights at home, stretching every dollar while the pandemic had left its heavy mark on their lives. Though Rachel did everything she could to shield Daniel from the full weight of their family's struggles, he was far from oblivious to the worries his mother carried. Despite the challenges, Daniel never complained. Instead, he found ways to help. He started walking the dog, raking leaves, and running errands for neighbors, earning a small amount of money that he carefully stashed in a tin box under his bed. For the past few weeks, he had been saving to buy the shiny red toy car he had seen in the grocery store, a reward he felt he deserved after all his hard work. "Are you excited to buy your car today?" Rachel asked as they entered the store, her voice gentle despite the exhaustion that had drained her, leaving behind only a faint smile. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I can't wait to try it. It's the kind that you pull back and it goes really far." Rachel chuckled softly as she grabbed a shopping cart. "You've worked hard for it, you deserve it." Her praise made Daniel's heart swell. He followed her through the aisles, his hands still carefully clutching the envelope in his pocket containing the $11 he had earned over the past 3 weeks. Rachel moved down the aisles with care, checking the prices of each item she picked up. Rice, beans, bread, and milk quickly filled the cart. Essentials, nothing more. Daniel noticed his mother hesitate when she reached for a carton of eggs, as though she was calculating its value in her head. Finally, she placed it in the cart with a soft sigh. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to tell her not to worry, but he knew she would brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine. As they approached the checkout, Daniel spotted the row of toy cars he had been dreaming of. His eyes lit up, and he quickly ran over, picking up the red car he had admired so many times before. He proudly held it up and dashed back to where his mother was unloading the groceries onto the conveyor belt. "Look," he said, beaming with a wide smile, "this is the one I want." Rachel's expression softened, and she reached out to gently tousle his hair. "You've worked hard for this. I'm proud of you." Daniel grinned, holding the car tightly to his chest as the cashier began scanning the items. Just then, he noticed a man standing at the counter on the other side. His shoulders were hunched, and he was rummaging through his pockets. His outfit, though neat, looked worn, and there was a heaviness in his demeanor, as though life had been relentlessly pushing him through one hardship after another. "I'm sorry, sir," the cashier said gently, "your card has been declined." The man's face flushed with embarrassment as he pulled out a crumpled bill and a handful of loose coins. He counted them again and sighed. In frustration, "I guess I'll have to leave some of these items," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel froze in his tracks, his hand loosening from the toy car. He watched the man set aside a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a bag of apples. He whispered an apology to the cashier. The sight made Daniel's chest tighten. He looked at the toy car in his hands, Then at the envelope in his pocket, the $11 he had worked so hard to save. A small voice in his head whispered that he had been saving for so long and he deserved the toy. But another, louder voice reminded him of what his mother had said, how proud she was of him. She was proud of him for working hard, and suddenly the thought of keeping the money for himself seemed petty and selfish. "Mom," Daniel whispered, tugging at Rachel's sleeve. "I want to help him." Rachel turned, surprised. "Daniel, that's your money. You've been saving it for weeks." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But he needs it more than I do." Before Rachel could respond, Daniel took a deep breath, stepped out of line, and approached the man. The stranger looked up, surprised as Daniel gently tapped him on the arm. "Excuse me," Daniel said hesitantly, holding out the envelope. "You can use this." The man froze, his face a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. "What?" he stammered. "No, I can't." "Please," Daniel insisted, his cheeks reddening. "It's okay, I want to help." At first, the man didn't speak. Gradually, he extended a trembling hand to accept the envelope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Daniel smiled faintly, a strange but wonderful feeling swelling in his chest. As the man completed his transaction, Rachel knelt beside Daniel and enveloped him in a tight hug. "What you did was a beautiful thing," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Daniel watched the man leave the store, his arms full of bags, walking with a slightly more upright posture. A sense of pride filled Daniel, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. The red toy car still sat untouched on the shelf, and he didn't know when he would have enough saved to buy it. But as they walked home, their grocery bag in hand, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had acquired something far more precious. Little did he know, his small act of kindness would change their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The following days passed in the familiar routine of Rachel and Daniel. Rachel worked long hours at the diner while Daniel focused on his studies and continued helping out around the neighborhood. Despite their modest life, Rachel always ensured their home was warm and full of love, with moments of joy and laughter filling the air. Daniel was the bright spot of each day, his optimism shining through even in the toughest times. One afternoon, Rachel's boss asked her to work an extra shift. The breakfast rush was always hectic, but she couldn't turn it down. "Daniel, you'll come with me today," she said as they prepared to leave. "I'll let you sit in the corner with some crayons. Is that all right?" Daniel nodded eagerly. He loved going to the diner, where he could sit and watch the comings and goings of people while drawing with his crayons. He would spend hours sketching everything from superheroes to toy cars, letting his imagination run wild. That morning, the diner was busier than usual. Rachel moved deftly between tables, taking orders and pouring coffee. Daniel sat in the corner near the window, drawing a car chase scene, occasionally glancing up to wave at his mother. Amid the hustle and bustle, the door chimed, and a familiar face walked in. It was the man from the grocery store. He wore the same outfit as before, neat but worn, and his eyes still carried the same weary kindness that Daniel remembered. He paused at the door, surveying the room for a moment before his gaze landed on Rachel. Recognition flickered across his face, and he made his way to an empty table near the window. When Rachel approached to take his order, the man hesitated before speaking. In a tone of surprise, "It's you," he said, sounding almost stunned. "From the grocery store." Rachel blinked, a little taken aback. "Yes," she replied, her face tightening slightly. "I remember." The man smiled warmly. "I'm David," he said. "Your son helped me that day. I've been thinking about it ever since." Rachel softened at the mention of Daniel. "It's understandable," she said, glancing at her son, who was still engrossed in his drawings. "He has a big heart." David nodded, his eyes turning toward Daniel. "It's more than that," he said. He didn't hesitate. He saw someone in need and acted immediately. "I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that," David said, his gaze filled with deep gratitude. Rachel wasn't sure how to respond. The sincerity in David's words was so clear that she could almost feel the gratitude in his eyes. "Your boy is special," she said softly, then sighed. But honestly, I'm just trying to teach him to see the good in people. David seemed to think for a moment, then spoke again. I want to thank both of you properly. Would you and Daniel join me for lunch tomorrow? My treat. Rachel hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to gestures like this and didn't want to impose, but there was something in David's sincere demeanor that made her trust him. All right, she finally replied. We'd be happy to accept your invitation. As David left the diner, Rachel walked over to Daniel and shared the lunch invitation with him. Do you remember the man from the grocery store? She asked. Daniel's eyes lit up. Yes, is he okay? He's fine, Rachel smiled. He wants to invite us to lunch tomorrow to thank you. Daniel grinned broadly. That sounds great. As they left the diner that evening, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter with David wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about it that made her feel as though this was the beginning of something much bigger, though she couldn't quite explain what was unfolding. The next day, Rachel and Daniel arrived at the restaurant where David had invited them. It was a cozy, family-owned place, with light streaming through the windows and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Daniel's eyes widened as he took in the neat tablecloths, fresh flowers, and the shiny silverware. Mom, this place is beautiful, he whispered. Rachel smiled, adjusting her dress. Though it wasn't new, she had carefully ironed it to look neat and presentable. Yes, she said softly. We must remember to thank David for inviting us. David was already seated at a corner table. When they approached, he stood up and greeted them with a warm smile. Rachel, Daniel, it's so good to see both of you, he said, shaking Rachel's hand and bending slightly to greet Daniel. How's it going, little man? Daniel smiled shyly. I'm good, thank you, he replied, his voice quiet but full of excitement. As they sat down, David ordered drinks for the three of them. He chose a tall glass of chocolate milk for Daniel, topped with whipped cream and a cherry. Daniel's eyes sparkled when the drink arrived. This is awesome, he exclaimed, carefully lifting the glass with both hands. Throughout the meal, David chatted with Daniel, asking about his favorite toys, hobbies, and dreams for when he grew up. The shy boy who had been reserved at first now eagerly talked about his drawings, toy cars, and his aspiration to become an engineer. David listened intently, smiling and nodding as Daniel shared. Rachel quietly watched, her heart swelling with pride. However, a question had been lingering in her mind ever since their encounter at the grocery store. Finally, as the meal was drawing to a close, she gently leaned toward David. David, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why didn't you have enough money to pay for the items at the store that day? You don't seem like the kind of person who would have trouble. David chuckled softly, looking a little embarrassed. That's a fair question, he said. Actually, that morning I had just paid a large bill, something I had been planning to take care of for weeks. I completely forgot, and by the time I got to the store, I only had a few dollars left in my pocket. I thought I had enough in my account to cover what I needed, but I miscalculated. It shrugged slightly. It was an embarrassing moment, one that no one can predict. But Daniel stepped in just before I had a chance to sort it out. He not only helped me pay but turned what could have been a bad day into one I'll never forget. Rachel's heart warmed as she listened to David's words, and she glanced at Daniel, who was fiddling with the silverware, listening intently. That's my son, Rachel said with a soft smile. He has a way of seeing when someone needs help. David nodded, his gaze filled with gratitude. It's not just that he helped, but the way he did it, without hesitation, without a second thought. That kind of generosity is rare, especially in someone so young. He reached under the table and pulled out a small gift bag, placing it in front of Daniel. Daniel, he said, I noticed you were eyeing this the other day. Daniel's eyes widened as he opened the bag and pulled out the shiny red car he had longed for. His mouth dropped open, and he lifted the car, admiring every detail. The car, he gasped. The car I wanted. David smiled. That's right, I couldn't leave the store without making sure you got it. Thank you so much, Daniel said, his face lighting up with joy. This is the best gift I've ever gotten. Rachel fought to hold back tears as she watched the happiness on her son's face. "David, you're so thoughtful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you." David smiled, waving off her gratitude. "It's the least I could do after what he did for me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, gently placing it on the table and sliding it toward Rachel. "Inside is a check for $10,000, he said. "I want it to go into Daniel's college fund, or for any dream he wants to pursue." Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "David, this is too generous," she choked out. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need to thank me," David replied calmly. "Your son reminded me of the power of kindness. He gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing, a reminder that there are still people who care. I just wanted to make sure he knows how much it means." Daniel looked up at his mother, his voice full of wonder. "Does this mean I can go to college, Mom?" Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she hugged Daniel tightly. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, "it means you'll be going to college." David smiled as he watched them, his heart filled with happiness. What had started as an embarrassing moment in the grocery store had now become something much more meaningful, a chance to give back and witness the incredible impact of a small act of kindness. In the days that followed, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about David's generosity. She carried the envelope with the check in her purse, occasionally opening it just to reassure herself that it was real. The amount on the check felt like a dream, and the opportunities it opened up for Daniel's future made her heart swell with hope and, at times, confusion. As for Daniel, the boy was always filled with excitement. Every night before bed, he would take the red car David gave him, driving it back and forth on the kitchen table, imagining the day when he could design cars even better than this one. "Mom," one evening as he played, Daniel asked her, "Do you think I could really make a real car one day?" Rachel smiled as she washed the dishes. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, sweetheart," she said. "And now, thanks to David, you'll have the chance to learn how to do that." That Sunday morning, Rachel decided it was time to do something meaningful with David's gift. She and Daniel went to the local bank to open a savings account in Daniel's name. The teller, a kind woman with glasses perched carefully on her nose, helped them complete the paperwork. When the check was deposited into the account and everything was settled, Rachel let out a long sigh, not realizing she had been holding her breath. "This means a lot, doesn't it, Mom?" Daniel asked as they left the bank. Rachel knelt down to his level, wrapping him in her arms with both hands. "This means more to me than anything," she said. "This is the start of your future, Daniel, the future you deserve." Rachel smiled, her eyes locked on her son. Daniel beamed, clutching the small receipt the teller had given him, as if it were proof that dreams really could come true. The next week, Rachel often thought about David's generosity and how it had spread into their lives. It wasn't just about the money, but how he had recognized Daniel's kindness and wanted to honor it. Inspired, Rachel decided to do something small to pass on that kindness. After her shift at the diner one evening, Rachel stopped by the grocery store, picking up a bag of fresh produce, some bread, and a few essentials for the kitchen. She and Daniel carried the bag down the hall and knocked on Mrs. Smith's door. Mrs. Smith was an elderly woman who had lived alone since her husband passed away. She opened the door slowly, her face lighting up when she saw Rachel and Daniel standing there. "Oh, hello you two," she said warmly. "What's this about?" "We thought you might need a little help," Rachel said, handing her the bag of groceries. "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Smith exclaimed, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You didn't have to do this." Thank you both." Daniel stepped forward, smiling. "My mom always says that little things can make a big difference," he said. Mrs. Smith nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "That's true," she said softly. "She raised a good son." On the way back to their apartment, Rachel glanced down at Daniel. "You know, David's kindness wasn't just for us," she said. "It's a reminder that we need to keep spreading kindness wherever we can." Daniel nodded seriously. "Like a ripple in a pond," he said. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Exactly," she said. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Rachel sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. She thought about all the ways life could unfold now, about the opportunities waiting for her son. Although the struggles hadn't disappeared, they now felt more manageable than ever. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream, believing that brighter days weren't just possible, they were within reach. Life continued in its familiar rhythm for Rachel and Daniel, but the current of hope that David's kindness had sparked remained strong. The check made out to Daniel wasn't just money, it was a promise, a symbol of possibility, lighting up even the darkest days. Daniel poured himself into his studies with renewed energy, inspired by the idea that he truly could achieve his dreams. At the same time, Rachel began to notice subtle shifts in how they approached life. Where once she felt weighed down by worry, now she found herself planning, real plans for a future she could now clearly imagine. One day, a letter arrived in their mailbox. It was addressed to both Rachel and Daniel, and when Rachel opened it, she recognized David's neat handwriting. Inside was a short but heartfelt letter. Dear Rachel and Daniel, I hope this letter finds you both well and happy. I've been thinking a lot about the time we spent together and about how your family has inspired me. It's not just Daniel's kindness, but the way you both live your lives with so much warmth and hope even when things aren't easy. I wanted you to know that I've decided to start something meaningful, a charity focused on supporting acts of kindness like the one Daniel did for me. This foundation will provide scholarships and support for children with big dreams, children who remind me of Daniel. I hope we can make a difference together. Warmly, Rachel read the letter twice, her hands trembling, before handing it to Daniel, who was sitting at the dining table, his eyes wide as he absorbed every word. Mom, Daniel said softly, we helped him start something amazing. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she pulled her son into a tight embrace. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. You really did. In the weeks that followed, the David Foundation began to take shape, and he kept in touch with Rachel and Daniel as he continued his work. True to his word, he named his initiative after the generous act of Daniel, ensuring that his story would inspire others to give without hesitation. Years later, as Daniel prepared to pack up for college, Rachel stood at the door of their small apartment, watching her son load his things into the car. The shiny red toy car still sat on his desk, a reminder of the day everything had changed. When Daniel turned back to look at his mother, his face lit up with excitement, and Rachel pulled him into a tight hug. You're going to do amazing things, she said, her voice catching with emotion. Daniel smiled, his eyes sparkling. Thank you, Mom, and thank you, David. He paused, thoughtful. And I'll remember to keep spreading that ripple. Rachel smiled softly, wiping away a tear. I knew you would. As the car drove off, Rachel stood at the door, watching until it disappeared around the corner. She felt a mix of pride and longing, but above all, she felt grateful to David, to Daniel, and for the unwavering belief that kindness could change the world. One small act, one big change. That was the message David had left behind, and it was the invaluable lesson that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. This story highlights the power of kindness and how small actions can change the world. Have you ever done something small that made a big difference in someone else's life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can inspire many and drive positive change. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of kindness and gratitude. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.